Hi guys, Jared here with Wireframe Workshop, and today I'm going to be showing you guys the tricks and techniques I used to create this scene. Alright, so starting off, I'm going to walk through a couple things that I have in Blender set up already. So these are the things that I have set in my startup file. First off, the thing that you probably noticed is that my default cube is blue. This you can get by clicking here and going to random, and it assigns a random color to every object in the scene, as you can see with all of these other objects over here. Next, I do have the Gscatter add-on from the folks over at Graswald. This is a free add-on that you can get from their website here. It does some really awesome stuff using geometry nodes to create particle systems that makes it really easy and fast to scatter a lot of objects on ground planes. I'm also going to be using some assets from their Island Reed Forest pack, as well as a couple of assets from an upcoming part 2 to this forest pack. Alright, so also in the setup, over here I am setting the render to 256 samples, and then down here in the view layer / render passes scene, I have the denoising data checked. This is so inside of the compositor, you can set up this setup here, which this is for the general denoising. You just add that by going filter, denoise, and you have that there. And you're going to plug the image to the image, the denoising normal into the normal, and denoising albedo into the albedo. And that will be your best and fastest denoiser inside of Blender for cycles. And then this I will show you at the end. This is just to add a little bit of chromatic aberration. I will probably do a little bit of lens distortion. It really helps to sell the realism inside of these macro scenes. So starting off, as you can see, I've already imported kind of my general palette of objects that I am going to use in this scene. Now I've intentionally left out the hero mushrooms that you saw in the thumbnail, so I can show you guys the process for importing those from Megascans. So I'm going to start off by deleting the default cube and adding in just a plane, which we are going to scale up a bit. Okay, here inside of Bridge, I am going to be using a couple of assets from Quixel. Now, these assets you do have to pay for to be able to use inside of Blender. They are free to download and use in Unreal Engine, and this is free to download, and you can use the free assets from here inside of any 3D program such as Blender. Okay, these mushrooms here are going to be our hero mushrooms, so we are going to export them at an 8K resolution, and we're going to go to the export settings and make sure that we have the high poly source here checked. This is going to give us the best possible settings for our hero assets. Okay, now that we have them in Blender, we're going to do something to them right off the bat. So this origin here is to parent them. And so if you move these around, you will see that parenting line connecting it to these. That means if I take this and move it around, it moves all of them. We don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and we are going to select this parenting empty, and we're just going to delete it right away. And now we have our assets free from any parenting to move around and do whatever we want with. So we're just going to separate them out here so we can actually see them a little bit. And another thing that we're going to have to do right off the bat is we are going to have to fix the shading of these. So right now, when you're exporting assets from Quixel Bridge into Blender, there is a bit of an issue in the way that it exports them. Okay, so here inside of the shader editor, we can see that the normal map is plugged into emission strength. We're going to put that into the normal input. And same with our gloss / roughness map, it needs to go into roughness. And then our specular map needs to go into specular. And then they also have here under clear coat, the clear coat needs to be at 0. I've got my references here in pure ref, and you can see inside some of these are pieces of art using these assets from Denoising, the art director at Quixel. You can see very obvious scattering through the mushrooms here. And this is something that does happen with real mushrooms. My references aren't the best for showcasing this. And so references with both real life references and then compositional artistic references are a great way for you to establish what these things look like in nature, in the real world. So how are we going to add that subsurface scattering to these objects in Blender? So the easiest way is to just take this subsurface slider and just start dragging it up. But as you can see, that turns our mushrooms white, or a little bit pinkish even. And that's not very realistic to how we want the light to scatter through the mushrooms. So what we're going to do is we are going to take the output from our albedo map and we're going to plug that into the subsurface radius. And so real fast without it, you can see here that these values are RGB, and that's going to tell us what wavelength of light is scattered at what radius or distance below the surface. So a really easy way to get immediately good looking results is to take the output from the albedo map and plug that into the subsurface radius. And you can see it's already looking a lot better. Also, this is another free add-on called Easy HDRI. It's another free, super easy to use add-on that's super handy. You just download it, install it, and then set the directory folder for where you have your HDRIs, and then you can just click and see a preview of it and choose them from the list. So for this scene, I'm probably going to go with this HDRI right here. I like to use this one a lot for a lot of my nature scenes. It gives really good shadows and it gives like a really nice ambient foresty feel. And then usually from here, what I do is I'll add in a sun lamp to act as my sun. Now the reason why I do it this way in HDRI plus a sun is it gives me a lot more control over the way that the sun is directed with the shadows and stuff. It gives me a lot of fine tuning detail over the exact strength of the light and the strength of the HDRI separately. And that way I can also change the orientation of the sun independent of the HDRI for reflections and things like that. And in a shadowy HDR like this, you're not going to get issues with like a double sun. And pressing Control, Alt, and 0, I'm going to snap the camera to my current view. And we're just going to start setting up a little bit of a composition. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in a ground texture. And again, we're going to go to Mega Scans for that. And for that, I'm going to go with this Mossy Forest Floor texture. And I am going to export that at a 2K resolution because this is going to be mostly covered up in our shot. And so we don't need a very high resolution. The areas that will be uncovered will be mostly out of focus in the background. And so we don't need that resolution for it. So I'm going to type in moss. There we go. Mossy Forest Floor right there. And it's not looking very good. And the reason for that is that 2 meter by 2 meter area that this texture covers is taking up the entire plane. So we're just going to go over and we're going to throw this to a much lower value, like 0.2. And if we hop back in, that's already looking a little bit better, but we're going to go a lot smaller. Let's go 0.05. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and take out a couple of these mushrooms, put them to the side, and start building a little bit of a composition. Okay, now that I have my basic composition set up, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work on the ground plane. We're going to go into edit mode here and we're going to subdivide it. Let's say 50 times. Let's go 100. Okay, and then now we're going to come in and we're going to choose this area right here. that we are going to be working in and around the most. Let's actually expand that just a little bit to like here. And we're going to go here and we're going to subdivide that another 100 times. And that is going to give us a really dense mesh to work with for the next step. So now we're going to go into Sculpt Mode. And for this, I like to set up a second 3D viewport here from the camera view. Make it just a little bit bigger so I can kind of see how my edits are affecting the composition. So now if we look at references, we can see that in some areas the ground kind of gets built up around the mushrooms, kind of in a general area. As they push through the ground, you can see both the general ground getting lifted from the mycelium network underneath, but also little bumps right next to the mushrooms themselves where they've pushed through the dirt. So we're going to go ahead and we are going to keep that idea in our heads as we are sculpting out this scene. Okay, I think I'm satisfied with that. So now what we're going to do is we are going to lift up the mushrooms so that their bulbs at the base are kind of sticking out a little bit. Somewhere kind of around in there. And now as you can see the individual polygons on the ground plane, and we don't want that. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our plane and we're just going to go Object, Shade Smooth, bam, disappears like magic. And this is a great way to get a higher poly look in your mesh without actually adding any extra polygons. It does have its limits though. If you have a really low poly object, it's not going to look super smooth. But in something like this where we clearly have enough polygons going on in the mesh, it's going to help us out, get that extra little bit of smoothness. Okay, now that we have our plane set up and our early composition established, we're going to go ahead and establish our depth of field. Now depth of field is the blurring that you can see of the background and the foreground. And this is what really is going to sell the size of your scene. So as you can see in this example by me, there's a lot of blurring in the foreground and the background. And this really sells that this is a small scene. Same with these shots. You can see it a lot even in the references. There's a lot of blurring in the areas in the foreground and in the background with a plane in the middle that's in really high detail. So we're going to go ahead and start setting that up. And the way that I like to set up the depth of field in my scenes is I will create an empty plane axis. And then from there, I'll say I want the focus to kind of be right around here in the scene. I'll go Object, Snap, Selection to Cursor. Now, this is how you get this empty to actually set up the depth of field in your scene. So you're going to go click Depth of Field here. After you select your camera, go to your camera settings, Depth of Field. You're going to click the eyedropper tool, and you're going to select the empty plane axis here. And now, if we go in and we click up here, you can preview your depth of field in your scene. So this is kind of strong. I don't want this mushroom to be completely out of focus or that mushroom to be completely out of focus. So we are going to go ahead and raise our aperture to 3.5. This is actually closing the aperture a little bit, but we don't need to get in that. And let's actually go a little higher. Let's say 4.2. Yeah, so that's better. So you can see this area here is slightly out of focus, but it'll be mostly in focus in the shot. And same with those. This mushroom back here is a little bit out of focus, but I think it'll end up working, and we can always tweak that value towards the end. I like to come back and rework it and get it into a finalized state. Okay, now that we have our basic composition and our depth of field established, we are going to go and we are going to start creating our moss system. And the way that you're going to create these is you're going to start by creating moss cards like these over here. And now these cards are created by taking a plane, move that over here. And real fast, I'm going to link the material. So this is a way that you can take a material from one object and put it on another. So you're going to take the object that you want to put it on, select that, then while holding Shift, select the other one, and now you can press Control L and click Link Materials. Now this and this share a material. So now I'm going to take these, I'm going to press Control I, which selects everything else in the scene, and I'm just going to press H to hide it, so that way we can work in the viewport display quicker for this demonstration. So now, as you can see, I have finished moss cards here, and I have a plane that contains some of those moss cards here. So the way that I go from this to that is I start by selecting it, and I go Tab into Edit Mode, and then I am going to press K to give us the knife tool. And you click and just create a little thing like that, press Enter, and now you have a square. And then you're going to want to go Face, select that square, and go P by selection, and now you have a little card. If I tab out of Edit Mode, you can see that it's its own separate thing. However, the origin is way over here, so we're going to go Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry. And now that's better, and then you can go Tab, select your little plane, and just move it into a nice spot on the origin. And bam, now you have a little card. And the weird shape of those is due to me going in and creating a smaller area like this. Like that. And then I then subdivided this plane and tried to displace it to give it a more natural shape. It didn't work very well, but the card itself is still totally usable and works just fine for the purposes that I need it for. So I never bothered to go back and just make it like this. And then the workflow for creating these ground planes here was the exact same. All right, so now we're gonna take these moss cards, or moss assemblies rather, and we're just gonna start kit bashing them around our scene. Okay, and now you can see that we're starting to run into a little bit of an issue real fast. So you can see these black areas here, and that's caused by not having enough passes to the transparency. So whenever you get these cards that overlap with each other, or any sort of plant-based or atlas-based model that uses a lot of opacity, you're going to end up with these if you have too many overlapping. And the way to fix that is to go into your render settings over here, go to light paths, and bump this up to say something like 50 or just a large number, and you can see, bam, they're gone. And that's how you fix that. So I'm going to keep kit bashing away, and I'll talk to you guys when I am happy with where the moss is at. Okay, so you can see that I have added some moss into this area here, as well as filled out some of the areas in the background in those areas. All right, so now from here, we're going to add our first system of twigs. So the system of twigs that I'm going to be using is going to be this one, the debris and twigs, and that'll give us a nice variation between some of these longer, thinner parts and some of these chunky, woody debris. So I have them imported here, and just like all of the other ones, I had to go in and fix the places. You can see that I also have added a hue saturation node and just dropped the value quite a bit to make them a darker color to kind of match the dark earthy texture that we had on this plane. So I'm going to select them all, and just like I did with the moss originally, I am going to click plus. You can see we have a massive system of twigs. You can also see there is kind of a grid pattern here, and that's because we don't have the random rotation on again. So now that's better. So we're going to go ahead and come into scale here, and we're going to drop this way down to like 0.2. And that'll still give us some large chunky debris, but that's what we're after right now. Since we don't need it everywhere, we're going to go ahead and come into distribution, add another weight mask, and we're just going to type in group, which is what we did for our original moss system. And then since you can't see anything, that's because our density is so low. So let's try like 10. You can see a couple things. And this kind of goes through in a problematic way. So what we're going to do is first we're going to actually go in and we're going to expand it just a little bit beyond here. And then the nice thing that you can do if you get something like this stick we don't want this huge stick sticking through our moss. So we're just going to go and we're going to click seed here till we find something that kind of adds a little bit of detail. And I feel like the scale is still kind of big, so we're going to drop this down even more to like 0.1. And then from here, in rotation, we're going to add some random on the X. And that'll give us some standing up of the twigs, as though they're being propped up on things. This is going to be blurry, so the fact that it's cutting through the moss won't be too much of an issue, most likely. But we can always come back and adjust that value. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start setting up some background. So we can see in our references that there's oftentimes background of moss or background of grass and other things such as like a log here. And I like to kind of use that same principle. So I use like a log in the background of this and plants there. So I think I'm going to actually use a rock. Yeah, let's go with this one. This one will work. So we're going to go in and we're going to leave this at 2K resolution, and we're actually going to go here, export settings, models. We're going to choose this LOD 0 because this will be a lot less polygons and make the scene less heavy. So a little bit of optimization going on. Realistically, we could probably get away with going even less, but I think this will be fine for now. So now that we have a little bit of a backdrop set, we're going to start filling in the in-between areas with some plants. And now Graswald ships with some plants. So you click on this library and you can see your selection of some basic assets with Gscatter. So I think I'm going to use, to start out, we're going to use this creeping bent grass small. And this is going to add some really small scale grass to the scene. And just like that, we already have it in and set up. So we're going to random rotation, scale. We're going to bring that random scale up a little bit. And the distribution, we are going to go ahead and paint a weight mask. And so since this grass is going to be really small in scale, I don't mind if it ends up mixing in with the moss a little bit. So we're going to go ahead, do something kind of like this. Fill it in. And if you kind of go above your camera like this, you can kind of see this is the line of the field of view of the camera. So real fast, just showing you, if I go in here and say change the field of view, you can see that triangle gets wider. And same if I increase it, it gets shorter. And that will just give us a different zoom on the lens here, which does affect things like depth of field and stuff, but I'll save that for another video. So now that that's full, we're going to go ahead and start bumping up the density. And I like to go with the grass just based off of like a visual density. Usually it's low enough in number that it doesn't really matter too much, in the same way that like the moss was earlier where we were using it like 10,000 plus. Usually the grass is going to be a lot smaller in number. So this density is probably good. I'm going to play with seed a little bit. This is what I jokingly call seed fishing. They're just fishing, hoping to catch a decent seed. And in this scene, because this stuff is going to be so out of focus in the background, this kind of stuff with it clipping with the rock is not going to be an issue at all. So again, just pop that up. See how that looks. So that's gonna look pretty full. So let's go ahead and save and see how this looks in rendered view to see how we like this grass here in the foreground. And just a quick tip real fast, while you're working back and forth between the two views of going shading and this kind of stuff, if you want to make this bigger to focus on this for a minute, you can just press Control Spacebar with your mouse on this scene, and that'll make that window full screen. I am liking how that's feeling so far, but we're going to go in and we're going to adjust the materials for this orchard grass, and we're going to make it have a little more variation. So I'm going to go back. And now with Graswald, the way that it works is it creates an instance of it here. So this is our control for all of those. And so I'm just going to select the tall ones here, grass tall, go here. And then there's our orchard grass small and our creeping bent grass there. So we're going to go here and we're going to come in and we're going to increase the age a little bit and make the age percentage lower. So that will make less of them follow this age. And then we're going to go ahead and increase the dead patches, something like that. And that'll just add in a couple that are really dead looking, and these ones will be a little less overly green. I'm going to come in and do the same to these. These ones are going to be a little bit younger though, since they're shorter. Oftentimes that means it's an earlier sprout and is more likely to be alive, which is why I'm going to leave these short ones as completely young. And you can see we have a little bit more color variation in these areas here, and this is new as well. I may even go in and turn the dead patches up a little bit more in this. And something that I like to do when we get to about this stage is it starts to get a little lost where the composition is. So what you can do is you can go in, oh, I don't have my screencast keys on. Oops. There we go. And you can come here and click render region, and that'll only render this area. And so that'll give you a better idea of what exactly is and isn't in frame. And so we can see some areas back in this where we definitely need to do a little bit more filling. So I'm probably going to increase the moss area a little bit here, and then I will start working on the next plant. All right, so that's looking a lot better. You can tell that that area is a lot fuller. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start adding in our next plant. I think I'm gonna end up changing this grass, but we'll leave it just for now. So when you get to this stage, there is going to be a lot of going back and forth between rendered view and the solid view as you're adding things and adjusting things slightly. So you can actually see these structures here are what were added, and that does a lot to change up the structures of the plants and adds variation to the background. So now we're going to go ahead and add in some smaller ones into this area. Okay, now that I found a seed that I like for the back and midgrounds, I'm going to go ahead and manually place some into the foreground. Sometimes this is what you need to do in order to give yourself that fine level of control on exactly how you want the grass to flow into the scene. Lots of times I try and take the grass and I try and like get it a little bit here to add just a little bit of a natural framing to the scene. It also helps to make it feel like you're peering through vegetation into the area and really establishes the depth of the scene, having elements in the front that are out of focus in addition to the elements in the back. And I think I want a little bit more of the grass peeking through down here, so I'm going to do the same thing with the bent grass and just Alt-B, copy some. There we go, that's a lot better. I'm going to stick with that, and now we are going to start building up the dirt particles and little twigs and bits. This is going to be where the scene gets heavy, so please be patient with the process. Alright, so now we are going to go and we're going to take the dirt, which are these little bits here. And so I have a dirt high poly and a dirt LOD 0, and that's, or LOD 1. And that's because we're gonna stack this dirt on top of this dirt to create more complex structures. So you can see in Daniel Wojci's art here, these really gritty, complex structures. And that's because he's stacking one dirt system on top of another, creating layering to it. And we're also going to go in and add a bunch of twigs of different sizes to create this visual mess of debris here. And you can just see how nutrient rich that soil is for these mushrooms. We are going to be using this forest debris with all of these little bits, and these are going to act as our dirt particles in the scene. And we're also going to have them exported at 2K resolution because they are going to be really tiny and they don't need very much detail in them. So now that I have this here, I'm going to crank it up a bit more. All right, so after spending a couple of hours working on the scene trying to figure out exactly what was going on, it seems as though there is an issue with the way that geometry nodes is implemented and not necessarily the way that Gscatter interacts with geometry nodes, where we can see that as we have a lot of geometry node systems here, there ends up being this massive slowing down of the processing that happens in the later systems. And so when we were trying to add a lot of dirt particles here, it was just not working at all. So the workaround for that I found that seems to be running beautifully is I just created a separate plane. You can just see a regular plane subdivided a bunch and then shrink wrapped down onto the surface. So I set the offset really low here, and what that allows us to do is it allows us to select this as our scattering plane for our Gscatter system. And so what I did there was I just went in, selected the dirt particles like I did before earlier, and created a new scatter system. And as you can see, we have a very high density on it, and it looks something like this. And so that will give us a really good base for adding in a twig system, and also we are going to be adding another particle system of dirt on top of this one by stacking them, which is a really cool thing that you can do with geometry nodes super easy inside of Gscatter. But we're going to go ahead and start with the twigs first. So that way we can have our dirt base built up before we add the levels to it. And now if I click off, you can see we have a pretty dense system here. I might come back and make it even more dense, but I'm going to see how it looks after we have our secondary dirt system on top of our original. So for doing that, we're going to go ahead and come in here, and we're just going to choose our dirt system, which is the collection 0.07. And we're going to go select the high poly dirt models for scattering on top of that. So I am going to go in and I'm going to add more to the twigs, and then we're going to see how it looks. Okay, so for the twigs, I left the density the same and I put the scale up to 0.003, made it just a little bit larger, and turned the random scale up, and I also went in and lowered the random rotation. So now we are going to take a look at how this is looking in rendered view. So that's looking pretty good, pretty nice and chaotic. A lot of detail in the dirt here between the twigs and the two systems. And that secondary system gives us a lot of height variation in the dirt as well, which you can see here against the mushroom. We have a lot of variation in how tall the mushroom or how tall the dirt system is. And there's still some areas here where the original ground texture is poking through. So I am going to go ahead and turn the base dirt layer here. I am going to up the scattering of this to, let's go 300,000. And this might take a second since we have the dirt system on top of the other dirt system. But there we go. Select off so we can see it. And you can see that area is pretty covered at this point. I think with the moss added in, things won't be too noticeable. So I'm going to go ahead and unhide everything, and we'll take a look at how it's looking with the whole scene. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with that for the moment. I'm going to go ahead and do our first test render, and we will look at it at a full 1080p scale. And I think from there we will then make some notes about what we want to change, and we will move on to adding another final layer of detail and making our final tweaks. Alright, so I rendered out our image and I decided to pull it into Photoshop to do a couple notes so I can visualize to you guys what I'm thinking of doing to make our finer adjustments before our final image. So I think first I'm going to end up taking this moss over here and move it up into this area. Just cover up some of that dirt or empty space there. I am probably also going to take this guy here and put him at a little bit of an angle like that. Also keep in mind I am a 3D artist, not a 2D artist. Other than that, I think it's in a decent spot. We're going to add some dirt particles onto the base of the mushrooms to create a little bit more messiness. I feel also like the dirt is looking just a little bit flat. So the way that we're going to fix that is by adding more of those twigs and slightly bigger chunks to break up some of these really fine flat shapes with a little bit chunkier shapes. Also, this background space here is feeling a little bit empty and a little distant. So I'm probably going to fill in the mid to background with like maybe a rock in this area and a little bit more foliage around it. Okay, now that we've made those changes, we're going to add the dirt to the mushrooms. The way that I like to do this is I like to select all of the mushrooms and I join them together as one object. So that way it'll make the weight painting really easy, and it'll also make it so that we only have to do one more particle system. So again, we're going to choose the high poly dirt that we had. We're going to duplicate it, and we are going to choose these mushrooms as our base. So obviously, again, way too big, but we're going to fix that. First, we're going to weight paint though. So let's go distribution, add effect. What we're going to do differently this time in the paint is instead of drawing it in with a brush, we're going to use the gradient tool, and then we're going to draw straight up like this. And then that way we'll get a relatively even spread of dirt across all the particles or all of the mushrooms, but still rising up with the majority of them on the bottom near the base and going up into the stalks. So I might actually make that a little bit higher. So now let's go into the scale and choose the scale that we had for the others. Something like that. Of course, randomize the rotation and go again fairly high. This one can be a lot lower, so let's go 2000 to start. We can already see them popping in, but we need to take that scale randomized scale way down. All right, so let's up this to 10,000. That'll probably be good. So let's see how that's looking. So that's looking really good. Something that I like to include in a lot of my scenes is these extra little chunks of debris sitting on top of the mushrooms and mixed in with the mushrooms. You can see he includes them with little leaves, and especially in Jan Major's scene here. Okay, so now to set up the second camera. You duplicate the camera, then come over here into the camera under the scene settings and switch it to the second camera. And from there, I usually kind of move around my scene, try and find like a nice second spot. So while I was setting this up, I was keeping in mind that I did want to create another camera. So I was kind of thinking something with these two on their own might be nice. Now, if we have issues with the backdrop, that's really easy to fill in. You just go in and weight paint more. But I'm thinking for this camera, we're probably going to also change the aspect ratio to like a 5:4, which will be 1350, I believe, by 1080. Should be, well, this would be 4:5. Okay, so I think this is going to work. We're just going to paint in some more details in the background, and I think we are probably good for our final render. Normally at this point, once I have both of my cameras set up, I tweak the lighting and try and get it into its final exact settings and orientation. But I think with this scene, I actually happened into the lighting that I am going to go with pretty early on. So I think I'm going to leave the lighting as is, and I think we're going to render out our final images. Okay, so real fast before we hop over to Lightroom to start making our edits, I wanted to show you what I have going on here in the compositor. So first we have the denoiser that I showed you how to set up earlier. And secondly, I have this node here, lens distortion. So what this does for us, as you can see if I take it off, is dispersion, which is the main thing that I want out of it. Gives us this chromatic aberration or fringing of reds and blues on the edges of our render. And this is an artifact that happens anytime that you are taking photos with a camera that has a lens. So when working with 3D, it's not always trying to replicate just real life and what real life does, but you're also trying to replicate real life through the view of a camera, because it turns out that like every single picture that you've ever seen was taken by a camera. And so you can see here when I have it off that there's nothing going on with the colors and the fringing. So I'm going to turn that off so you can see just the dispersion. So when I turn it on, you're going to start seeing some reds being pushed up here and blues being pushed down there. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what distortion does. First, we're going to click fit here, and that's going to make sure that the distortion doesn't take away anything in the corners and keeps the image fully in frame. So the distortion is going to kind of bubble, so to speak, the middle of the frame and warp the edges of the frame back a little bit. And this is an effect that you would get primarily from a macro lens, or if you're shooting a small scene like this, it'll become very apparent. I don't do this for the majority of my scenes, just whenever I'm working with a macro scene. So I'm going to give it a really low value, like 0.003. And you can see how it pushed out the middle of the frame there a little bit. So that is all of the compositing that I do inside of Blender. So now I'm going to take us over to Lightroom and show you guys the edits there. Okay, now that we're in Lightroom, I'm going to walk you through my editing process. So starting off, I like to just hit the auto button and see where that takes me. So you can already see that it's done a little bit to the exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, etc. So the area that it pushed up the most was probably the vibrance here, which is kind of like the saturation. I'm probably going to walk that back down just a little bit, probably somewhere around there. And so something I like to do with a lot of my scenes is I like to bump up the texture a little bit. This is kind of like sharpening, but more enhances the detail that's already there rather than just performing a post process on like hard edges and the like. And then I also like to add a subtle vignette. And this just helps to pull the viewer's focus kind of here into the more focal elements. And a very wise adage that I learned was that a good vignette should be felt, not seen. And then one last thing that I like to do in here before I start doing some more detailed edits is I like to zoom in and start adding some grain. So grain helps a lot with adding a subtle feeling of the lensing and the sensor and that kind of more technical side of the light capture in the camera. Because if you zoom in on any picture, you're going to start seeing grain, especially here in these background areas where things are going to be out of focus. That's where you'll be able to see it the most, is in like these bokeh here. Okay, so now I'm gonna do some more detailed edits. And inside of Lightroom, you have masks. And these allow you to go in and make some more detailed edits to certain parts of your image without affecting the rest of the image as a whole. So I'm gonna start by pressing select subject and seeing if it can detect these mushrooms. Sometimes it does a good job, other times I have to go in and paint by hand. So this time, as you can see, it did a really excellent job of getting just the mushrooms. There is this blade of grass here, so I will probably come in and mask that out. Okay, now that I have everything correctly masked, I'm gonna go ahead and come in and I'm gonna increase the texture on the mushrooms just a tiny bit more. Probably somewhere around in there. And I'm gonna go ahead and crank up the saturation just a little bit, just to push those reds a little bit more. Probably somewhere in there. I may come back and touch the color temperature here, but I'm gonna wait until I've finished with the background. So next I am going to mask out the background, and I'm gonna make some edits based on that. Okay, a little trick I wanted to show you guys inside of Lightroom is if you when you're selecting your background, if you select the brush and then you press this minus to add another effect that's a subtractive effect, you can then choose this select subject, which will mask out your your subject from your background. So that way you can just paint straight over your main area like this, and it won't paint in anything that is selected as the subject. So that makes it super fast. You just go straight over the top and you can get a really quick result that looks really good like this. There are a couple little areas here that are technically considered part of the subject, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to do an additive brush and paint over those by hand, but this is a great way to get you a nice base really fast. Okay, now that I'm satisfied with the masking job on this, I'm going to come in and I'm going to use an old 2D trick of pushing the background just a little bit cooler. And so tinting the background blue is an old animator's trick to create a feeling of distance. And where it actually comes from is creating a fake atmospheric effect of things further away tend to be more blue in the distance. Now, obviously, our scene is way too small of a scale for atmospheric scattering to be coming in. However, it's a nice trick to create a little bit of tonal contrast, with the foreground being a little bit warmer and the background being a little bit cooler. So I am going to repeat the same process for the second image, but that will about wrap us up. Here are our final results. I hope you guys learned something today and had fun following along. I will have links in the description for the add-ons that I used. I will also have a Discord channel where you guys can interact with me linked in there, and follow us on Instagram, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks.